Alright, we're back with Truckstang 2. It's been a while since we played with this car, since we've been bouncing around from one project car to another, among other things. Off camera I did manage to take care of a couple little bits and pieces. We can see the front valence panel is hanging down, and that's only because I had to take the fender off in order to replace a panel right here that was horribly rusted out. Managed to find that panel in a batch of parts that came in the 71 Mustang. And since that car did not need this patch panel, it only made sense to utilize this panel to fix this stuff here. So this is all welded up inside and out, ready to rock and roll. I could put a battery tray in here whenever I'm ready. That'll be straight. Main reason we're here though is to do a bunch more bits and pieces. Really the main focus I have is trying to get the electrical system set up in here as primitive as it's going to be. I'm recycling parts, actually, using an old fuse panel from another vehicle and just bunches of random garbage to piece the electrical system together, because all we really have here is our engine management system, which is going to be an HEI distributor, electric choke for the carburetor, and then going to use an aftermarket gauge cluster on there, which is going to be its own module by itself. And then, of course, our headlights, taillights, and turn signals. Like I say, we're really not going to have a lot of crap in here because, well, this is more of a wastelandy kind of car. This is not exactly a luxury vehicle that needs a lot of electrical garbage wired up. So I'm going to go ahead and get the bits and pieces so we can start putting this stuff together. Okay, we have this old fuse strip that I pulled out of the Chevy Love pending a rewiring. This uses the cylindrical fuses from older cars versus the flat style that you'll see in newer-ish stuff. Anyway, this thing's got a lot of terminals on here. Plan's going to be to daisy chain these strips right here and connect it to the 12-volt input, which will then allow me to branch off from any of these terminals here to feed any individual load. Since we're not going to actually have a lot of stuff hooked up in here, I might not even need but half of these fuses to do any real work. As far as mounting this thing, I put a couple ankle braces on here with some nuts and bolts, and the plan's going to be to mount this thing right here where it's easily accessible while sitting upright versus under the dash where you'd have to get on your back to get to the fuses. We're going to do that right there and use some self-tappers on that right bracket, and probably drill a couple holes on the left side where I could force some sheet metal screws through the other bracket on the left. So with that all said and done, get this thing mounted, we can start looking at running some wiring, starting with the 12-volt feed and our connection to loop across these terminals. Stand by. Alright, we got our fuse strip mounted. Like I said, self-tapping screws and regular sheet metal screws holding the thing in place. Also have some other wires routed from the engine bay into the firewall. Give me a quick second. We have our main power feed wire secured with the little clamp things. I don't know what the hell you call them, but anyway, wire secured from where the battery will go, routed all the way around across the firewall and into the cab area. Also managed to get a couple of wires routed out of my scrap pile. I had a 2-into-1 wire that I cut from some other garbage, but have our wire right there for the choke on the carburetor routed along that path, along with our wire that'll be going to the HEI distributor that will go there, all routed through the firewall going back into the cab area. And all the wires are routed across here with the power wire going right here to this thing, plugged into this little terminal block, and then another line coming out of the terminal block going into the fuse holder where it actually feeds these 3 fuses. And then that wire right there is the one that's going to that 2-into-1 wire feeding the engine area. Still have a couple other wires I got to hook up. Also need to see if I could actually find the key to this ignition tumbler thing right here, or cylinder, and see if this thing actually works. Because if this thing actually works, I got the wire right here. I could utilize that for my ignition switch and all. So I have to go ahead and hunt down a key. Otherwise, if not, our ignition switch is going to be nothing more than a toggle switch and a push button for the starter. So again, stand by. Another little thing that we need to address is wiring up our alternator as far as our engine management stuff is concerned. This is a 2G second generation internally regulated Ford alternator. It's got the regulator right here, but it also has a plug that has wires on it, and got our little schematic right here. I'll put the link to this in the description box, but these two thick wires right here are actually coming off of the rectifier, which is connected to the stator, and these go right to the battery. On the regulator, this thick yellow wire also goes to the battery, so in reality this wire and these two wires are all going to be connected together into one. This wire right here, black and white wire, will be going to the black and white wire right here. They just jump together. And then this green wire is going to the ignition source, where it gets switched power to start all this mess up when the car is running. Pretty simple, actually. Not as simple as the 3G setup that just has, I think, just this setup here, and everything else is kind of internally wired up. But we're going to get this garbage all put together so I could get it back in place, get all the wiring situated the way it needs to be, and continue on with bigger and better things. So, as usual, stand by. Since we left off with the alternator, we're going to start back up with the alternator. Our two plugs have our jumper right here connected up. We have our switch 12-volt line hooked up and routed along the firewall into the cab. We have our single high current yellow line and the two other ones soldered together to a single red cable, all routed up to here where they'll be connected to a battery terminal when I do get a battery tray in here. Also have our starter solenoid mounted in place with its switched 12-volt line hooked up and going along the firewall into the cab. All those wires are staged under the dash for the time being. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the key for this ignition cylinder, so we're going to have to go with the plan B, which is just going to be push buttons and switches. I'll mount those eventually and be able to get our wiring hooked up to the fuse box for those switches and all that other garbage that's staged under there. So with all that said and done, let's go ahead and move on to the switches. Okay, I changed my mind on using simple switches and all. I went on Amazon and picked up one of these universal ignition switches. It has all the terminals necessary to wire up a car. You have your battery in, have your accessory line for all the garbage you normally would wire up, like radios and the like. You also have your ignition terminal where you'll route your distributor to, because you need this line to be hot, whether it's on the accessory side or in the start side. And of course the center line is the starter side where you hook up your starter solenoid. So with that little setup explained, I go ahead and install this thing. Got a lot of extra wiring already put in here, so go ahead and wire this garbage up, mount our switch, and move on to some more electrical stuff. So stand by. Okay, we have our ignition switch in place. Had to use a ball joint washer in order to create a good solid surface with which to secure this thing with the nut that comes on this thing, so we could at least turn this thing without it spinning around in the hole. Because of the nature of the ignition and accessory terminals on this switch, I had to isolate the circuit that feeds our dizzy and electric choke over to this single fuse right here. The line going to the engine for the dizzy and the choke is on the other side of this fuse. This yellow line right here is going to the ignition terminal on our switch. And the accessory line from the ignition switch is right here, feeding this bank of 3 fuses, which currently just has our alternator hooked up to it. So when that key switch is in the accessory or start position, this yellow line will always get power to feed our engine. When that thing is in the standby or accessory position, that'll only get power when it's in that position, but not when it's in the start position. So with all that said and done, our ignition switch, key switch is in place, ready to rock and roll. The next thing I want to wire up now is our brake light / turn signal. We have some generic LED tail light, brake light, turn signal lights. These are only a single circuit though, so these are actually going to only be able to be used for our brake light and turn signal with the use of one of those aftermarket turn signal boxes like we used on Truckstang 1, where it'll break the circuit for the brake light to use as a turn signal when need be. These reflectors right here are actually going to go on either side of the tailgate. So when we have the tailgate closed from behind, it'll have the traditional triple tail light Mustang look right there. If the tailgate is lowered down, obviously you won't see these reflectors, but you'll still be able to see our brake light turn signal set up. As far as tail lights are concerned, I'll have to add a whole nother light fixture just for the tail lights that'll probably be mounted somewhere low so it doesn't take away from the visual effect of our triple Mustang style tail lights. So with that all said and done, I could go ahead and get these things mounted, get all this garbage mounted, get the wiring run for that, so when we do get the turn signal switch and the brake light switch, we could wire it all up real quick and easy. So as usual, stand by. Okay, we have our taillights all done, reflectors in place as well. We use some 2-conductor wire to carry the circuit from that light underneath here, and once we get right here, another 2-conductor wire which will carry both positive legs for the tail lights is spliced in, with all the grounds also spliced together and hooked up right there at that junction. The 2 positives for the tail lights is routed along this channel and under the dash, where it follows this path and comes around and up to here where our turn signal switch will go later on once that is had. Also, if we could see it, it's kind of right there in the distance. There's a pigtail for the brake light switch. That's all wired up with a black and red and a white and red wire right here, and the black and red is routed over to our fuse box to bring power into that pigtail, and then routed through the switch to the white and red, which is going to be hooked up to our turn signal switch, which will then branch that power off to our twisted pair right here to go to the tail lights. I do still have to get a couple of amber lights for the front for those turn signals and wire that all in as well, but that'll be later. Once I get that in the turn signal switch, we can get that whole circuit all done. So with that, we're going to move on to something else. Let me see what that might be. I think our next something else is going to be headlights. I have a couple of H4 style pigtails for these old sealed beam bulbs, and I got a floor dimmer switch and then just a regular toggle switch I'm going to use for the main headlight switch since it's available. But I could go ahead and start wiring that up. Because these are sealed beam bulbs that suck a lot of power compared to LEDs, I'm probably going to wire in some automotive relays to carry that extra amperage, while our simple little circuit right there is just going to be used to switch those automotive relays. And then I'll have inline fuses for the high amperage side of that circuit. So let me gather some components and we could start putting that trash together. Okay, we pretty much have the majority of our headlight circuit done, save for the tail lights. We have our H4 pigtails wired in, have a bundle of wire here. We also have our main power line hooked up to the starter relay, where our battery cable for the positive side will also go, so it'll feed a constant positive into here through this inline fuse and along here and over into here to these automotive relays on the contacts, and along with the ground straps and the other sides of the contacts going to the actual circuits for the bulbs. We have our 2 lines right here going into the cab to go to our headlight switch. We have our standard headlight switch right here. Well, it is a headlight switch now, But that's wired in, hooked up to the fuse box with our line going to the dimmer switch right there. So one side has the 12 volts coming from the switch and routed directly to the low beam side. So as soon as the switch turns on, that automotive relay turns on for the low beam. And then the other side is going to the high beam relay. So when that switch is activated down there, it'll activate the relay for the high beam side. Simple setup, all done. Another thing I'll be able to take care of now is our brake light switch. Can't really put the whole thing in because, well, I still got to put a master cylinder in there, and it doesn't make sense to snap this thing in place only to have to pull it back out again to put the master cylinder in there. So I'm just going to plug the thing up so it'll be in the circuit for the brake light turn signal setup, which I won't be able to finish that until I get the lever box for the steering column. So go ahead and knock that out real quick. And here we are. Our brake light switch is plugged up and in the circuit, awaiting final hookup once I do get a master cylinder in place. The next thing that I need to finish up is wiring our single wire for our taillight circuit, which is routed along the same path in this rocker channel going to the back of the car. And once I get a pair of taillight fixtures, I can wire them into this single wire, which will in turn be wired into the low beam headlight circuit. So when those come on, which they'll stay on all the time when the headlight switch is on, the taillights will come on. One other thing I need to start on is getting our front turn signals set up. We have the stock fixtures in the grill, and I sourced a couple of light sockets from some junk, and these actually happen to twist and lock into the sockets here, so we're actually pretty good. Didn't have to buy anything for our front turn signals. When I do run the wires, they're going to follow the same path as all this other wiring going into the cab, so we'll keep things nice and neat. And once we get our switch box in place, we'll have front turn signals as well as the rear turn signals. So let me get started with the rest of this wiring. The next order of business I need to do is fabricate an angle iron battery rack so I can get a battery situated right here so we could finish wiring that side of the car's electrical system up. So simple thing, some bed frame angle iron, a grinder and a welder, and we will get this right here. We got our angle iron welded in place in the corners, as we could see. Took a piece of some bracing, welded it right here as an extra support. Also took another piece of similar bracing and put it right here to act as another lip to hold the battery in position, so we can secure our battery properly without it sliding all over the place. Obviously, I'm going to have to put some type of tie down, bungee cord, something to at least hold the battery in place in the tray, so if I hit a bump or something, this battery doesn't go jumping out of the tray. But for all intents and purposes, our battery rack is done, so we can go ahead and at least try to wrap up this aspect of the system, like the positive terminal. I'm not going to use that battery because that thing's old, but positive terminal for the battery, ground terminal, the line going to the starter, we can get that all knocked out while we wait for our turn signal box and other components. So as usual, stand by. Okay, we have our ground cable and positive cable to the battery, but I'm going to have to get some terminals to crimp up a cable to go to the starter from the solenoid. So we'll be moving on from that and going to installing a gauge cluster. This little cheap Chinese gauge cluster that was in the FMT, but is now sitting right here because I put a regular gauge cluster in that truck. We have our oil and temperature sensors right here to go to this thing. Since this is just going to be more of a showy kind of car and not necessarily a street car, I could get away with a more chintzy kind of setup like this compared to a traditional gauge cluster that you would want for a street car. But With this, I could at least strap this thing to the steering column, route this whole wire loom through the firewall and over to the engine and hook up the sensors and get powered to it, ground, and this thing will be all done. And then we can move on to our final aspects of our electrical system. So let me go ahead and get inside and get this going. Okay, we have our gauge cluster in place. I have it currently wrapped up with a plastic bag to shield it from any possible rain or anything, since, well, there's no windows, but it's screwed up to this structural member for the old gauge cluster panel. Got our wires going out and hooked up to respective spots on the fuse box and ground, and then coming out through the firewall right there with our line going over to the oil sender, as well as the rest of the wiring going out along the same path as the rest of the engine bay circuitry. And we have our line for our temperature sensor hooked up right there as well. So everything is all neatened up with zip ties and ready to rock and roll. One other thing I wanted to take care of, on our tail light brake light situation, the original lights I had were only a 2-conductor, basically on and off. I ended up finding some similar ones to these fixtures that were 3-conductors, so I could actually have my tail lights and brake light turn signals. So these will be replacing these, but at least I have the wires already routed for the tail lights, so all I got to do is just wire that back into this same circuitry for the brake light turn signal circuit, and then just hook up the tail light circuit to the other lead. So go ahead and knock that out real quick. All right, we have our new fixtures in place. Doesn't look much different from the other ones, so we're good to go on that. So now we can move on to our turn signal box. Just like on Truckstang 1, we use one of these things in place of switches or other generic means of activating the turn signals. This one here wires into the brake circuit, as well as has its own turn signal circuit that breaks the circuit to the brake light on either side. So it works almost the same as a stock setup. And other than being worm clamped to your steering column, really not much else to this thing other than just, well, wiring it up. And we already have most of the wires for the turn signals and brake lights routed up to the steering column. So let me just put this thing in real quick. Give me a minute. All right, we have our universal turn signal box strapped down. Everything's wired up. Got the excess wire zip tied down as neatly as possible. Don't ever want to cut all this wire to make it short, because if I ever change any of this around, having short leads on that box would pretty much make it a pain in the butt to rewire back in, adding all this new wire. But either way, got our flasher there integrated into the circuit. Have our brake light switch that's also integrated into the circuit. Yeah, right there. Not going to be able to do a whole lot with it easily. I have to use a screwdriver to cycle the brake light switch manually. But either way, with all that said and done, we get a battery in here and we can start testing some of this garbage out. So let's do that. All right, go ahead and turn the key on. Our little gauge cluster unit comes on. Got voltage readings. We have a temperature reading, which is obviously ambient temperature because, well, the engine's not running. And we don't have any oil pressure or anything because, well, the engine's not running. But got our switch there. I'm gonna listen. Solenoid fires like it's supposed to. Now, next thing we'll go ahead and do is look at our infamous turn signal box. I'll have to strap this camera down so we can actually view the lights coming on and off as I cycle the turn signal box and the brake lights. So let me go ahead and do that. I'm going to do a test where I turn the turn signals on left and right respectively and cycle the brake lights a few times, then turn the turn signals on left and right again while cycling the brake lights. So just watch for that. Now I'll turn on the hazard lights. Both sides will flash at the same time. Okay, at the front, we're going to cycle the turn signals again so we could see the left and right ones come on respectively. Then I'm going to turn on the headlights. Low beam, then high beam, or whichever one the switch is currently in. You'll see the intensity change on the headlights. Take a quick walk to the back and we'll see the tail lights should also be on. Try to get at the right angle so we could see our kind of dim tail lights, as they should be dim. We have both tail lights, so that's all good. So there we go. All the vital circuits are operational for all intents. Can't really test the alternator or the gauges until, well, we get the engine running, but we have power going to the alternator, so at least we could say that that should be enough. Now, as long as the alternator is good and the regulator on the alternator is good, that crap should work too. But for all intents, we're ready to go on the electrical system. So now our next moves are going to be piecing this thing together, but we're not going to be doing that in this installment. So, as usual, we're going to end it here, and stay tuned for more on Truckstang 2, because obviously there is plenty more before we see this thing roll around. So, as usual, like, subscribe, notifications, TikTok, all that good stuff, and we'll catch you later.